The wine glass trembled in my hand as I watched Rachel collapse to her knees, clutching her stomach and gasping for air. The entire family reunion fell silent, except for the sound of her retching into the decorative planter by the deck stairs. My name is Venus, and what you're about to hear is how a single moment of clarity saved my life and exposed the sister I thought I knew. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Have you ever felt that chill run down your spine when you realize someone you love has been planning to destroy you? That's exactly what happened to me at our family's annual reunion at the lake house in Cedar Falls, Michigan. Rachel had always been the favorite, the one who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes, but I never imagined she'd go this far. When I saw her slip something into my wine glass while she thought I was distracted, every piece of the puzzle finally clicked into place. The morning started like every other family reunion weekend. I drove up to the lake house with butterflies in my stomach, not from excitement, but from the familiar dread that came with these gatherings. The house had been in our family for 3 generations, a sprawling cedar and stone structure that sat right on the water's edge with a wraparound porch that overlooked Lake Michigan. It should have been a place of comfort and joy, but for me, it had become a stage where I played the role of the forgotten daughter while Rachel performed as the star. I pulled into the circular gravel driveway, noting that Rachel's brand new BMW was already parked in the prime spot closest to the front door. Of course it was. Even in parking, she managed to claim the best position while leaving me to haul my bags from the far end of the drive. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted from the backyard, mixed with the gentle lapping of waves against the dock. I took a deep breath, grabbed my overnight bag, and prepared myself for another weekend of being overlooked, dismissed, and treated like I was lucky just to be invited to my own family gathering. Mom appeared at the front door before I could even knock, her face lighting up with the kind of smile that looked genuine but felt rehearsed. Linda Parker had perfected the art of making everyone feel welcome while somehow making it clear who truly belonged. She wore a flowing summer dress in pale yellow, her graying hair styled perfectly despite the humidity, and her jewelry caught the afternoon sunlight in a way that seemed almost theatrical. "Venus, honey, you made it!" she exclaimed, pulling me into a hug that lasted exactly 3 seconds before she stepped back to examine me with that familiar critical eye. "You look tired, sweetheart. Have you been getting enough sleep? You know stress shows on your face." And there it was. Less than 30 seconds through the door, and already I was being told what was wrong with me. I forced a smile and hefted my bag higher on my shoulder. "Just work keeping me busy, Mom. You know how it is." She hummed, already looking. Past me toward the driveway as if expecting someone more important to arrive. "Well, Rachel's been here since yesterday helping me set up. She's such a natural hostess, that girl, always thinking of others." Rachel had driven up from Chicago where she worked as a marketing coordinator for a boutique firm, a job she'd landed through one of Dad's golf buddies after college. Meanwhile, I'd been grinding away as a forensic accountant in Detroit, a career I'd built entirely on my own merit, working nights and weekends to get my CPA while paying my own way through graduate school. But somehow, Rachel's ability to arrange appetizer platters made her the more valuable daughter. I followed Mom through the familiar hallway lined with family photos. The pictures told the story of our family dynamics in painful detail. There was Rachel at every birthday party, Christmas morning, graduation ceremony, always front and center with that radiant smile. And there I was, usually in the background or on the edge of the frame, sometimes cut off entirely. It was like looking at the documentation of my own erasure, one snapshot at a time. The backyard was already bustling with activity. Uncle Robert was manning the grill, his booming laugh carrying across the lawn as he told the same fishing stories he'd been recycling for 20 years. Aunt Margaret sat in one of the wicker chairs on the porch, her knowing eyes catching mine, as I emerged from the house. She was the only one who'd ever seemed to see through the family dynamics, the one who'd quietly slipped me $20 bills at Christmas with a whispered, "This is just for you," when I was growing up. Cousin Tyler was down at the dock with his girlfriend, both of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. I couldn't blame them. These reunions had a way of making everyone feel trapped in roles they'd outgrown, playing out the same scripts year after year. And then there was Rachel, holding court near the outdoor bar setup, surrounded by relatives hanging on her every word. She wore a flowing white sundress that somehow managed to look both casual and expensive, her long blonde hair styled in loose waves that caught the breeze perfectly. She had this gift for making everything look effortless, even when I knew she'd probably spent an hour getting ready. When she saw me, her face lit up with what anyone else would have taken for genuine sisterly affection. "Venus! There's my sister!" she called out, practically bouncing over to give me one of those embraces that looked loving from the outside, but felt cold and calculating up close. "I was wondering when you'd finally make it. We were starting to think you'd decided to skip out on us." The words stung because they carried just enough truth to hit their mark. I had considered skipping the reunion. Part of me did that every year, weighing the emotional cost against the family obligation. But I always came, always showed up, always played my part as the dutiful daughter who was grateful just to be included. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, matching her bright tone while my stomach knotted with familiar anxiety. "Looks like you've got everything under control here." "Oh, you know me," she laughed, tossing her hair in that practiced way that drew everyone's attention. "I just love bringing people together. It's like Mom always says, I have a gift for making everyone feel special." Dad emerged from the house, carrying a cooler of beer, his face already flushed from the heat and probably a drink or two. David Parker was a man who commanded attention without trying, the kind of presence that filled a room and made everyone else adjust their energy to match his. He'd built a successful insurance agency from nothing, and he never let anyone forget it. When he saw me, he nodded with the kind of acknowledgement you'd give a coworker at a company picnic. "Venus, good to see you made it up from the city. How's work treating you?" It was the same question he asked every time, delivered with the same disinterested tone that made it clear he was asking out of obligation rather than genuine curiosity. I could have told him about the major embezzlement case I'd just cracked, the one that had made headlines in the Detroit business journals, but I knew his attention would drift before I finished the first sentence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Going well, Dad. Staying busy." That's good," he replied, already looking toward Rachel, who was laughing at something Uncle Robert had said. "Your sister was just telling us about this new client she landed. Sounds like a real coup for her agency." And there it was, the subtle redirection that always happened. Rachel's minor work achievements became major victories worth celebrating, while my actual successes got filed away under, "That's nice, dear." I'd learned to expect it, but it still felt like a small death every time. The afternoon unfolded, with all the predictable rhythms of our family gatherings. We ate lunch on the porch, played cards at the dining room table, and took the traditional group photos down by the water. Through it all, I found myself watching Rachel more carefully than usual, noticing things I'd previously written off as quirks or personality traits. The way she positioned herself in every conversation to be the center of attention. How she subtly redirected compliments aimed at others back to herself. The practiced laugh that seemed to come at exactly the right moments to keep people engaged. The way she'd touch people's arms when she talked to them, creating this illusion of intimacy that made everyone feel special and chosen. But more than that, I started noticing how she looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. There was something calculating in her gaze, something that felt more like assessment than sisterly affection. It made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite articulate. As the sun began to set, the family started gathering on the back deck for what had become our traditional evening ritual. Mom would bring out the good wine, Dad would make a toast about family bonds and shared memories, and we'd all pretend that we were closer than we actually were. This year felt different, though. There was an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't identify, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Rachel volunteered to help Mom set up the wine service, which wasn't unusual. She always positioned herself as the helpful daughter, the one who anticipated needs before they were expressed. I watched from my chair as she arranged the glasses on the serving tray, selecting a particular one for each family member with what seemed like careful consideration. "Venus, I picked out something special for you," she called over, holding up a glass filled with deep red wine. "It's that Cabernet you mentioned loving at Christmas. I made sure Mom got a bottle just for tonight." The gesture should have felt thoughtful, but something about it made my skin crawl. I'd never mentioned loving any particular wine at Christmas. In fact, I rarely drank wine at family gatherings because it made me feel vulnerable in a group where I already felt like an outsider. But Rachel was smiling at me with such apparent sincerity that questioning her would have made me look ungrateful and paranoid. I accepted the glass with a smile and a thank you, noting how she lingered for just a moment longer than necessary, watching me with those bright blue eyes that suddenly seemed less warm and more predatory. The wine smelled right, looked normal, but something in my gut told me to be careful. Dad called for attention and raised his glass for the traditional toast. This was always the most awkward part of the evening for me, listening to speeches about family loyalty and unconditional love from people who had spent my entire life making me feel like a conditional member of their club. But I played my part, raising my glass and smiling at all the right moments. "To family," Dad declared, his voice carrying across the deck with practiced authority. "To the bonds that can't be broken and the love that never fades. To another year of making memories together at this house that represents everything we value most." Everyone echoed his sentiment and began to drink. I brought the glass to my lips, but something made me hesitate. Call it intuition, call it paranoia, call it whatever you want, but in that moment I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff. Instead of drinking, I pretended to take a sip while actually keeping my lips closed. The conversation flowed around me as the evening progressed, but I found myself increasingly focused on Rachel. She kept glancing at me with what I'd initially taken for sisterly concern, asking if I was feeling all right, if the wine was to my taste, if I needed anything. But now her attention felt suffocating rather than caring. "You're not drinking much," she observed during a lull in conversation, her voice carrying just the right note of casual concern. "Are you feeling okay? You seem a little off tonight." "Just tired from the drive," I replied, taking another fake sip. "Long week at work." "You work too hard," she said, settling into the chair next to mine with her own glass of wine. "You need to learn to relax, enjoy life a little more. That's what these family weekends are for, right? To forget about all the stress and just be present with the people who love you." There was something almost hypnotic about the way she spoke, like she was trying to lull me into compliance. I nodded and smiled, but internally I was becoming more alert, more suspicious. Why was she so invested in my wine consumption? Why did she keep steering the conversation back to how I should relax and let my guard down? The answer came when she excused herself to use the bathroom, and I saw her glance back at my still full glass with something that looked dangerously close to frustration. In that moment, everything clicked into place with terrifying clarity. She hadn't just selected that wine for me out of thoughtfulness, she'd tampered with it. My heart started racing as the implications hit me. My own sister had drugged my wine. But why? What could she possibly hope to accomplish? And more importantly, what was I going to do about it? I looked around at my family, all of them relaxed and enjoying their evening, completely oblivious to what was happening right under their noses. I thought about all the years of being overlooked, dismissed, and treated like I was lucky to be included. I thought about every slight, Every time my achievements were minimized while Rachel's were celebrated, every family photo where I was pushed to the background. And then I thought about what might have happened if I'd actually consumed whatever she'd put in that wine. The thought made me feel sick and angry in equal measure. This wasn't just sibling rivalry or family dysfunction. This was something much darker and more dangerous. When Rachel returned from the bathroom, I was ready for her. I'd made my decision in those few minutes alone with my racing thoughts and pounding heart. I was going to turn the tables on her, but I needed to do it carefully, strategically. I needed to make sure everyone saw exactly who Rachel really was beneath that perfect exterior. She settled back into her chair with a satisfied smile, clearly expecting to see me becoming drowsy or disoriented by now. Instead, I looked her directly in the eyes and raised my glass in a private toast. "To sisters," I said loud enough for everyone to hear, "and to the bonds that reveal who we really are." Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. But it was enough. I knew I had her attention now, and more importantly, I knew I was right about what she'd done. The evening was about to take a turn that none of us would ever forget, least of all Rachel. But first, I needed to make sure that when she fell, everyone would be watching. The realization that my sister had drugged my wine should have terrified me, but instead it filled me with a strange sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. Everything suddenly made perfect sense. All those times Rachel had insisted on bringing me drinks at family gatherings, her overly attentive behavior whenever I seemed tired or stressed, the way she'd hover around me with that concerned expression that I'd mistaken for sisterly love. She'd been testing, experimenting, waiting for the perfect moment to execute whatever plan she had in mind. I sat there on the deck, surrounded by the warm glow of string lights and the sound of gentle waves lapping against the shore, holding a glass of poisoned wine while my family laughed and chatted around me, completely unaware that they were witnessing an attempted crime. The surreal nature of it all made me feel like I was watching someone else's life unfold in slow motion. Rachel was telling Uncle Robert about her latest work project, something about landing a major cosmetics account that would put her agency on the map. Her voice had that musical quality that drew people in, made them want to lean closer and hang on her every word. She gestured with her wine glass as she spoke, her movements graceful and deliberate, every inch the perfect daughter who could do no wrong. But I could see through it now. Every laugh was calculated. Every smile was a weapon. Every gesture was designed to manipulate and control. How had I been so blind for so long? How many times had she undermined me while wearing that mask of sisterly concern? My mind raced back through decades of memories, re-examining them through this new lens of understanding. The time in high school when I'd gotten violently sick the night before my college entrance exam, forcing me to take it weeks later when I wasn't fully prepared. Rachel had brought me soup that evening, insisting I needed to keep my strength up. I'd been so grateful for her care, even as I'd struggled through the test with lingering nausea and brain fog. The job interview I'd missed 3 years ago because of a mysterious stomach bug that hit me the morning of what would have been a career-changing opportunity. Rachel had stopped by my apartment the night before with takeout, saying she'd noticed. I'd been stressed and wanted to make sure I was eating properly. I'd thought it was sweet of her to worry about me. The family vacation where I'd spent 2 days bedridden with what everyone assumed was food poisoning, missing the announcement that Grandma Parker was updating her will and wanted to discuss her plans with all the grandchildren. Rachel had been so attentive during my illness, constantly checking on me and bringing me ginger ale and crackers. She'd even taken notes during the will discussion so she could fill me in later, though somehow those notes had gotten lost. Pattern after pattern emerged as I sat there pretending to sip my wine, each memory revealing a new layer of manipulation and deceit. Rachel hadn't just been the favored daughter who got everything handed to her. She'd been actively sabotaging me for years, ensuring that I stayed in the background while she claimed the spotlight. But why tonight? What was so important about this particular family gathering that she'd felt the need to drug me? I looked around the deck, studying each family member's face for clues. Dad was deep in conversation with cousin Tyler about the upcoming football season. Mom was showing Aunt Margaret photos on her phone, probably from Rachel's latest social media posts. Uncle Robert was refilling his beer and settling in for what looked like a long evening of storytelling. Everything seemed normal, routine, exactly like every other family reunion we'd had over the years. But something was different. There was an undercurrent of anticipation in the air, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. And then I remembered the phone call. 3 weeks ago, Dad had called to remind me about the reunion dates, which was unusual because Mom typically handled all the family correspondence. During our brief conversation, he'd mentioned that he had some important family business to discuss with everyone, something about the future of the lake house and making sure everyone was on the same page about long-term plans. At the time, I'd assumed it was just Dad being dramatic about routine maintenance issues or maybe property taxes. But what if it was something more significant? What if he was planning to announce changes to his will or decisions about inheritance or the transfer of property ownership? The lake house was worth close to $2 million now, sitting on prime waterfront real estate that had appreciated dramatically over the past decade. If Dad was planning to announce inheritance decisions tonight, Rachel would want me incapacitated and unable to participate in any discussions or negotiations. She'd want to ensure that I couldn't advocate for myself or question any arrangements that favored her. The wine wasn't just meant to make me sick, it was meant to remove me from the equation entirely. The thought made my blood run cold, but it also filled me with a fierce determination I'd never experienced before. Rachel had underestimated me, assuming I'd be the same passive, grateful sister who'd spent her whole life accepting whatever scraps the family threw her way. She had no idea that I'd been quietly building my own life, my own career, my own sense of self-worth that didn't depend on their approval. As a forensic accountant, I'd learned to see patterns that others missed, to follow paper trails that revealed hidden truths, to stay calm under pressure while building airtight cases against people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. Rachel might have been the family manipulator, but I was the one with actual professional training in uncovering deception. I excused myself to use the bathroom, carrying my wine glass with me to maintain the illusion that I was still planning to drink it. Once inside the house, I moved quickly through the familiar hallways to the kitchen, where I found what I was looking for. Rachel's wine glass sat on the counter where she'd left it when she'd gone to the bathroom earlier. Without hesitation, I switched the contents, pouring my drugged wine into her glass and her untainted wine into mine. My hands were surprisingly steady as I made the exchange, years of feeling powerless in this family, finally giving way to decisive action. If Rachel wanted to play games with poison, she could experience the consequences of her own choices. I wasn't going to be her victim anymore. I returned to the deck with my heart pounding but my expression calm, settling back into my chair as if nothing had changed. Rachel was still holding court with Uncle Robert, but I could see her glancing at me periodically, clearly waiting for signs that whatever she'd put in my wine was taking effect. "Venus, you're looking a little pale," she said during a break. In conversation, her voice dripping with false concern. "Are you sure you're feeling all right? Maybe you should drink some water." "I'm fine," I replied, taking a deliberate sip from my glass of her untainted wine. "Actually, I'm feeling better by the minute." She frowned slightly, probably confused by my improved demeanor when I should have been getting drowsier or sicker. "Well, make sure you're staying hydrated. Sometimes the lake air can be dehydrating, especially when you're not used to spending time here." The subtle dig about me not being used to spending time at the family lake house didn't escape my notice. Even while trying to poison me, she couldn't resist reminding everyone that I was somehow less connected to our family traditions than she was. But I just smiled and nodded, watching as she absently picked up her wine glass and took a generous sip. "You're absolutely right," I agreed. I should definitely finish this wine and then switch to water. It would be terrible if I got dehydrated and missed out on whatever Dad wants to discuss with everyone tonight. Something flickered in her eyes at that, a brief flash of panic that confirmed my suspicions about the evening's agenda. She knew exactly what Dad was planning to announce, and she'd been trying to make sure I wouldn't be coherent enough to participate. The conversation continued around us, but I found myself studying each family member with new eyes, wondering who else might be aware of Rachel's true nature. Aunt Margaret caught my gaze and gave me a subtle nod, her expression thoughtful in a way that made me wonder if she'd been watching tonight's dynamics more carefully than I'd realized. Uncle Robert was telling one of his fishing stories, the one about the 30-pound salmon that had gotten away during his trip to Alaska last summer. It was a story we'd all heard multiple times, but everyone listened politely because that's what you did at family gatherings. You performed your role, followed the script, pretended that everything was normal and healthy and loving. But tonight felt different. Tonight I wasn't performing anymore. I was observing, calculating, preparing for whatever was about to unfold. And I wasn't the only one. Tyler kept checking his phone like he was expecting important news. Mom seemed nervous, fidgeting with her jewelry and glancing at Dad whenever she thought no one was looking. Even Dad appeared more serious than usual, like he was building up to something significant. Rachel, meanwhile, was starting to look uncomfortable. She'd finished about half her wine, and I could see her pressing a hand to her stomach occasionally, probably attributing any discomfort to anxiety about whatever she thought was going to happen to me. She had no idea that she'd just consumed whatever cocktail of drugs she'd intended for me. "I think I need to use the bathroom again," she announced after about 20 minutes, her voice slightly strained. "All this wine is going right through." She stood up a bit unsteadily, catching herself on the back of her chair with a look of confusion. "Wow, I guess I'm more tired than I thought. Maybe I should switch to water too." "Good idea," I said smoothly. "You do look a little flushed. Are you feeling all right?" The irony of asking her the same question she'd been asking me all evening wasn't lost on either of us. She shot me a sharp look, but it was harder to focus than usual, and I could see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to figure out why she was feeling off when I seemed perfectly fine. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Just need a minute." She made her way into the house, moving more carefully than normal, and I couldn't help but feel a small surge of satisfaction. After years of being the victim of her manipulations, I was finally the one in control of the situation. While Rachel was inside, Dad cleared his throat and stood up, wine glass in hand. This was it. Whatever announcement he'd been building up to all evening was about to happen, and Rachel was going to miss it entirely. I wanted to wait until everyone was relaxed and enjoying themselves before bringing this up. He began, his voice taking on the formal tone he used for important business discussions. "But your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking about the future, about this house and what it means to our family." He paused to take a sip of wine, clearly savoring the moment. Dad had always enjoyed being the center of attention, especially when he had important news to share. "We've decided it's time to start making some concrete plans about inheritance and property transfer. We're not getting any younger, and we want to make sure everything is handled properly while we're still here to oversee the process." My heart started beating faster. This was exactly what I'd suspected, but hearing it confirmed made the stakes feel suddenly real. Whatever Rachel had been planning, it had been about this moment, this announcement, this opportunity to shape the family's financial future. "We've had the house appraised recently," Dad continued, "and we've been consulting with our attorney about the best way to handle the transfer. There are tax implications to consider, family dynamics to think about, and we want to make sure we're being fair to everyone." Uncle Robert leaned forward in his chair, clearly interested in the financial details. "What kind of timeline are we talking about, David?" We're thinking about making the transfer within the next year, Dad replied. But there are some decisions to be made about how to structure it. The house could be transferred to one person, who would become responsible for maintenance and property taxes, or it could be held jointly with shared responsibilities. I felt like I was watching my future being decided in real time, and I was grateful beyond words that I was present and alert for this conversation. If Rachel's plan had worked, I would have been passed out in a chair or vomiting in the bathroom while my family discussed arrangements that would affect the rest of my life. "Where's Rachel?" Mom asked, looking around the deck with concern. "She should be here for this discussion." "She went to the bathroom," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "She was feeling a little unwell. Maybe we should wait for her to come back." Dad shook his head. "We can fill her in later. I want to get the basic framework outlined while we're all together." He went on to explain that he and Mom had been considering various options for the lake house transfer. They could leave it to both daughters equally, which would require us to work together on all decisions about the property. They could leave it to one daughter with financial compensation for the other, or they could sell it and distribute the proceeds equally. Each option had different implications, and Dad was clearly looking for input from the family about which approach made the most sense. It was exactly the kind of discussion where an articulate, present, engaged daughter could advocate for herself and influence the outcome. And it was exactly the kind of discussion where an absent or incapacitated daughter would be left out entirely. As Dad talked through the various scenarios, I found myself thinking more clearly than I had in years. The forensic accountant in me automatically started analyzing the financial implications of each option, considering tax consequences and long-term value propositions. But more than that, I was finally seeing my place in this family with complete clarity. I wasn't the forgotten daughter who should be grateful for whatever scraps they threw my way. I was an equal heir with every right to participate in these decisions and advocate for my own interests. Rachel's attempt to drug me had backfired spectacularly, not just because I'd avoided the immediate consequences, but because it had finally opened my eyes to the true dynamics at play. "I have some thoughts about the options," I said when Dad paused in his explanation. "From a financial planning perspective, there are some considerations that might not be immediately obvious." Dad looked surprised but pleased by my engagement. "Of course, Venus. We'd love to hear your input." For the next 15 minutes, I outlined various scenarios and their implications, drawing on my professional knowledge to provide insights that clearly impressed everyone present. I talked about property tax advantages, estate planning strategies, and market trends that could affect the property's future value. It felt incredible to finally be heard, to finally be seen as someone whose opinion mattered. Aunt Margaret was nodding along with obvious approval, and even Uncle Robert seemed impressed by my knowledge and analysis. For the first time in my life, I felt like a valued member of the family discussion rather than an afterthought. And through it all, Rachel remained conspicuously absent. Whatever she'd put in my wine was clearly having a significant effect, keeping her away from the most important family conversation we'd had in years. The conversation that she'd tried to ensure I would miss entirely. When Dad finally wrapped up the initial discussion and suggested we table the detailed planning for a future family meeting, I felt a sense of accomplishment and vindication that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I'd not only survived Rachel's attack, I'd turned it to my advantage. But the evening was far from over. Eventually, Rachel would have to return to the deck, and when she did, everyone would see exactly what kind of person she really was. The sister they'd always thought was perfect was about to reveal her true nature in the most public and humiliating way possible. As if summoned by my thoughts, I heard the sound of retching coming from inside the house, followed by a crash that sounded like something breaking. The conversation on the deck stopped abruptly as everyone turned toward the house with concern. "What was that?" Mom asked, starting to rise from her chair. I'll check on Rachel, I offered, setting down my wine glass with a steady hand. She mentioned feeling unwell earlier. But before I could even stand up, we heard Rachel's voice calling out weakly from inside the house. "Help," she called, her voice strained and panicky. "Something's wrong. I think I need to go to the hospital." The irony was perfect. She'd intended those exact words to come from me, but instead, she was the one experiencing the consequences of her own actions. As my family rushed toward the house to help her, I took a moment to appreciate the poetic justice of the situation. Rachel had spent years manipulating and undermining me, always staying just subtle enough to avoid detection. But tonight, her own weapon had been turned against her, and there would be no hiding from the consequences. The evening was about to become very interesting indeed. The chaos that erupted inside the house was everything I had hoped for, and more. Rachel's cries for help echoed through the cedar walls, each desperate plea a testament to the justice that was finally being served. I followed my family as they rushed inside, maintaining the perfect facade of concerned sister while internally savoring every moment of her downfall. We found Rachel collapsed on the bathroom floor, her pristine white sundress now stained and wrinkled, her carefully styled hair plastered to her sweaty forehead. She was clutching her stomach and dry heaving over the toilet, her entire body shaking with the effort. The sight should have filled me with sympathy, but instead I felt a cold satisfaction spreading through my chest like ice water. "Oh my God, Rachel, what happened?" Mom dropped to her knees beside her, maternal instincts overriding everything, else as she reached out to touch Rachel's clammy forehead. "You were fine just 20 minutes ago." "I don't know," Rachel gasped between waves of nausea. "I started feeling dizzy and sick all of a sudden. My heart is racing and I can't think straight. Something's really wrong, Mom. This isn't normal." Dad appeared in the doorway, his face creased with worry as he took in the scene. Behind him, Uncle Robert and Cousin Tyler crowded together, trying to see what was happening. The whole family was witnessing Rachel's collapse, just as I had planned. "Should we call an ambulance?" Tyler asked, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. "She looks really bad." "Yes, call them now," Dad ordered, his voice sharp with authority. "And call Dr. Henderson, too. He might be able to give us some guidance while we wait." As Tyler dialed emergency services, I moved closer to Rachel, kneeling down beside Mom with what I hoped looked like genuine concern. Up close, I could see that her pupils were dilated and she was having trouble focusing her eyes. Whatever she had put in my wine was clearly powerful stuff, and the irony that she was now experiencing its full effects was almost too perfect to believe. "Rachel, can you tell us exactly how you're feeling?" I asked in my most caring voice. "Any specific symptoms? Did you eat or drink anything unusual?" She looked at me with confusion and growing suspicion, her drug-addled brain trying to process why I seemed so alert and composed when she was falling apart. "I just had wine," she mumbled, her words slightly slurred. "The same wine everyone else had. This doesn't make sense." "Sometimes people react differently to alcohol," I said smoothly, reaching out to touch her arm in a gesture of sisterly support. "Especially when you're stressed or tired. You have been working so hard lately." The look she gave me was sharp despite her condition, a flicker of understanding beginning to dawn in her clouded eyes. But before she could say anything, the paramedics arrived, their professional competence filling the small bathroom as they began their assessment. "Can you tell us what happened, miss?" the lead paramedic asked as he checked Rachel's pulse and blood pressure. "Any medical conditions we should know about? Any medications you're taking?" Rachel struggled to focus on his questions, her condition clearly worsening as whatever drug she'd intended for me continued to work through her system. "No medical conditions," she managed to say. "I just suddenly got sick. Really sick." "Any chance you consumed alcohol or recreational drugs tonight?" the paramedic continued, his tone professional but probing. "Just wine," Rachel insisted, though her voice was getting weaker. Family dinner. Normal wine. The paramedic exchanged a look with his partner, clearly recognizing symptoms that suggested more than just alcohol consumption. "We're going to need to take her to the hospital for evaluation," he announced. "Her vital signs are concerning, and we need to rule out poisoning or drug interaction." The word poisoning sent a ripple of shock through my family. Mom gasped and grabbed Dad's hand, while Uncle Robert muttered something about calling the police. But I remained calm, the perfect picture of a concerned sister dealing with an unexpected family crisis. "Poisoning?" I repeated, injecting just the right amount of alarm into my voice. "But how is that possible? We all ate and drank the same things." "Sometimes it can be accidental," the paramedic explained as he and his partner prepared to move Rachel to a stretcher. "Bad reaction to medication, contaminated food, even deliberate tampering. The hospital will run tests to figure out what's going on." As they loaded Rachel onto the stretcher, she managed to grab my wrist with surprising strength for someone in her condition. Her eyes locked onto mine with a clarity that cut through the drug haze, and I could see that she knew exactly what had happened. "Venus?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the commotion. "The wine. You switched the wine." I leaned in closer, pretending to comfort her while actually ensuring that only she could hear my response. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Rachel. You're obviously confused and hallucinating. That's probably just a side effect of whatever you're going through." Her grip tightened on my wrist, desperation and rage fighting against the drugs in her system. "You can't prove anything," she hissed. "Even if you switched them, you can't prove I put anything in your glass." "You're right," I whispered back, my voice calm and steady. "I can't prove anything. But you know what I can do? I can let everyone draw their own conclusions about what happened here tonight. About why you collapsed after drinking wine that you personally selected and served. About why you're talking about switched glasses and proof when no one else even mentioned those things." The horror in her eyes was beautiful to see. She was realizing that her own words were condemning her, that her drug-clouded brain was betraying her by revealing information that only the perpetrator would know. She was exposing herself in real time, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Let's get her to the hospital," the paramedic said, interrupting our whispered conversation. "Her condition seems to be deteriorating." As they wheeled Rachel out of the house, I followed along with the rest of the family, playing my role perfectly. Mom was crying, and Dad was making phone calls, while everyone else buzzed with shock and concern. But underneath all the chaos, I could see the questions beginning to form. Why had Rachel collapsed when everyone else was fine? Why was she talking about switched glasses and proof when those concepts hadn't been part of any conversation? Why did she seem to know more about what had happened to her than someone who was supposedly the victim of random poisoning should know? Aunt Margaret fell into step beside me as we walked to the cars, her sharp eyes studying my face with an intensity that made me slightly nervous. She'd always been the most perceptive member of our family, the one who saw through pretenses and social facades to the truth underneath. "Interesting evening," she said quietly, her tone carefully neutral. "Terrifying is more like it," I replied, matching her casual tone. "I can't believe Rachel got so sick so suddenly. Thank God we were all here when it happened." "Yes," Aunt Margaret agreed, but there was something in her voice that suggested she was thinking about more than just Rachel's condition. "Thank God indeed. Though I have to say, you're handling this crisis remarkably well, Venus. Most people would be more shaken up by seeing their sister collapse like that." I felt a chill of warning, but I kept my expression concerned and sisterly. I guess my work training is kicking in. When you deal with financial crises and corporate emergencies all day, you learn to stay calm under pressure. She hummed thoughtfully. "I suppose that's true. Still, it's interesting how differently people react to unexpected situations. Some people fall apart, Some people rise to the occasion, and some people seem almost prepared. The word hung in the air between us like a challenge, and I realized that Aunt Margaret might have observed more of tonight's dynamics than I'd given her credit for. But there was nothing I could do about it now except continue playing my part, and hope that Rachel's own behavior would be damning enough to deflect any suspicion. At the hospital, we settled into the familiar rhythm of family crisis management. Dad handled the paperwork and insurance questions while Mom paced the waiting room, wringing her hands. Uncle Robert called other family members to update them on the situation, and Tyler documented everything on his phone like he was building a case file. I positioned myself as the helpful daughter, fetching coffee for everyone and making sure Mom had tissues and Dad had his phone charger. It was a role I'd played many times before during family emergencies, and it felt natural to slip back into it even under these extraordinary circumstances. The doctor who eventually came out to speak with us was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Dr. Sarah Chen introduced herself and gestured for our family to follow her to a private consultation room where we could talk, without disturbing other patients. "Your daughter is stable," she began, which caused Mom to release a breath she'd been holding for hours. "But we are concerned about some of the symptoms she presented with. Her blood work shows evidence of chemical substances that are consistent with deliberate poisoning." The room fell silent except for the sound of Mom's sharp intake of breath. Dad's face went white, while Uncle Robert muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer or a curse. "Poisoning?" Dad repeated, his voice hollow with shock. "Are you saying someone deliberately tried to hurt Rachel?" "The substances we found in her system are not naturally occurring," Dr. Chen explained carefully. "They appear to be a combination of sedatives and anti-anxiety medications that were likely dissolved into a liquid and consumed orally. The concentration suggests this was not accidental exposure." I felt a thrill of vindication mixed with genuine curiosity about what exactly Rachel had intended to do to me. Sedatives and anti-anxiety medications would have left me drowsy and compliant, unable to participate meaningfully in any family discussions or decision-making. She hadn't been trying to kill me, just neutralize me at a crucial moment. "Can she tell us what happened?" Mom asked, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Did she see who did this to her?" Dr. Chen's expression became more guarded. "She's been inconsistent in her statements. The drugs are affecting her cognitive function and memory formation. She's made several references to switched drinks and deliberate tampering, but she seems confused about whether she was the victim or the perpetrator." The doctor's words sent another wave of shock through my family. Even in her compromised state, Rachel was inadvertently confessing to attempted poisoning. Her own drugged rambling was building the case against her better than any evidence I could have planted. "What do you mean by that?" Dad asked, his voice tight with growing understanding. "She keeps saying things like, 'The wrong person drank.' It was supposed to be different," Dr. Chen explained. "She also asked the nurse if we could test her sister's blood, which is an unusual request for someone who claims to be the victim of random poisoning." I watched my family's faces as the implications sank in. The confusion, the denial, the slow dawning of horrible realization as they began to understand what Rachel's words really meant. She hadn't been the target of someone else's attack. She had been the attacker, and something had gone wrong with her plan. "You're saying Rachel might have poisoned herself accidentally?" Tyler asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. "I'm saying the evidence suggests she had knowledge of the poisoning that goes beyond what a typical victim would know," Dr. Chen replied diplomatically. "The police will need to investigate further to determine exactly what happened." Police. The word hit me like a physical blow, though I tried not to show it. I'd been so focused on the immediate satisfaction of watching Rachel suffer the consequences of her actions that I hadn't fully considered the legal implications of what I'd done. If they investigated thoroughly enough, Would they be able to prove that I had switched the glasses? But as I thought about it more carefully, I realized that any investigation would likely work in my favor. Rachel's own statements were already implicating her as the perpetrator rather than the victim. And even if they somehow proved that the glasses had been switched, that would only reinforce the conclusion that Rachel had been trying to poison someone else and had accidentally consumed her own weapon. "We'll need to speak with all of you individually," Dr. Chen continued. "The police will want statements from everyone who was present tonight, and we'll need to know exactly what everyone ate and drank." Over the next 2 hours, we each met with Detective Maria Rodriguez, a sharp-eyed woman who seemed to see through every carefully constructed facade. When it was my turn, I sat across from her in a small hospital conference room and told my story with the perfect mixture of shock, concern, and bewilderment. "So you were all drinking wine together on the deck," Detective Rodriguez summarized after I'd finished my account. "And your sister specifically selected your glass and brought it to you." "Yes, she said she'd picked out something special for me," I confirmed, allowing a slight tremor to enter my voice. She seemed so thoughtful, making sure everyone had their favorite wine. I never imagined that someone could use that kindness as a weapon. "And you didn't notice anything unusual about the wine when she handed it to you?" "It looked and smelled normal," I said truthfully. "I might have noticed something if I'd taken a big drink right away, but I was tired from the drive and I was sipping slowly." Detective Rodriguez made notes on her pad, occasionally glancing up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Your sister has been making some interesting statements while under the influence of these drugs. She seems to think that someone switched her glass with yours." I let confusion and hurt cross my face. I don't understand why she would say something like that. Why would anyone switch glasses? And if she thought someone had tampered with her drink, why didn't she say something before she collapsed? "Those are excellent questions," the detective agreed. "Questions we'll be exploring as we investigate this case." She asked me a few more questions about family dynamics, recent conflicts, and whether I'd noticed any unusual behavior from Rachel lately. I answered everything honestly, while carefully framing Rachel's behavior in a way that suggested instability and potential jealousy without making any direct accusations. When the interview was over, Detective Rodriguez handed me her card and told me she might have follow-up questions as the investigation progressed. I thanked her and returned to the waiting room, where my family was processing the implications of what they'd learned. "I can't believe this," Mom was saying, her voice hollow with shock. "My own daughter tried to poison her sister. How did I not see the signs?" "What signs were there to see?" Uncle Robert asked gently. Rachel seemed like the perfect daughter. Sweet, helpful, always thinking of others. "That's just it," Dad said, his voice heavy with realization. "She was too perfect, too helpful. And now I'm thinking about all those times Venus got sick. At important family events, all those opportunities she missed because of mysterious illnesses. The pieces were falling into place exactly as I'd hoped they would. My family was finally seeing the pattern of Rachel's behavior, finally understanding that her apparent perfection had been a mask for something much darker. They were realizing that I had been the victim of a long-term campaign of sabotage, and that tonight had simply been the most brazen attempt yet. Aunt Margaret appeared beside me, her expression thoughtful as she watched Mom crying into Dad's shoulder. "You know, Venus," she said quietly, "I always wondered why such a smart, capable woman seemed to have such terrible luck with timing. Getting sick before important events, missing crucial opportunities, always seeming to be one step behind, despite being clearly the more competent daughter." I looked at her carefully, trying to gauge whether her words were supportive or suspicious. "I guess some people are just unlucky," I said slowly. "Or some people have help being unlucky," she replied, her eyes meeting mine with unmistakable understanding. "But sometimes justice has a way of correcting the balance, doesn't it?" The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Chen returning to update us on Rachel's condition. She was stable and the drugs were beginning to clear her system, but she would need to stay overnight for observation. More importantly, she was becoming more coherent, which meant her statements to the police would become increasingly credible as evidence. "She's asking to see her family," Dr. Chen said, "but I should warn you that she's been quite agitated. She keeps insisting that someone set her up, that this is all a misunderstanding. The police have advised us that she might try to manipulate the situation or blame others for what happened." Perfect. Even the medical professionals were warning my family that Rachel might try to lie and manipulate them. Any attempts she made to tell the truth about what had really happened would be dismissed as the desperate fabrications of someone trying to avoid responsibility for her crimes. When we were finally allowed to see her, Rachel was propped up in a hospital bed looking pale and defeated. The IV in her arm and the monitoring equipment surrounding her made her appear vulnerable, in a way I'd never seen before. But when her eyes met mine across the room, I saw that the intelligence behind them was fully intact. "Venus," she said, her voice still slightly hoarse but clear enough to be understood. "We need to talk. Privately." "I don't think that's a good idea, sweetheart," Mom said, moving to Rachel's bedside with renewed maternal protectiveness. "You need to rest and focus on getting better." "No, you don't understand," Rachel insisted, struggling to sit up straighter despite the restraints of her medical equipment. "Venus knows what really happened tonight. She knows because she's the one who did this to me." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and I could see my family's faces cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing anger. But the anger wasn't directed at me. It was directed at Rachel for making such a desperate and obviously false claim. "Rachel, honey, you're still affected by the drugs," Dad said firmly. "You're not thinking clearly. Venus is your sister. She would never hurt you." "She switched the glasses," Rachel shouted, her voice rising with desperation. "I put something in her wine and she figured it out and switched our glasses. That's why I'm here instead of her." The confession was everything I could have hoped for and more. In her desperation to implicate me, Rachel had just admitted to attempted poisoning in front of our entire family. She'd confessed to the very crime she was now trying to blame on me, and her own words had sealed her fate. "Oh, Rachel," Mom whispered, her face crumpling with disappointment and heartbreak. "Oh, my baby girl, what have you done?" The rest of the visit was a blur of tears, accusations, and family members trying to process the magnitude of Rachel's betrayal. She continued to insist that I had somehow orchestrated the entire situation, but every word she spoke only made her look more guilty and more desperate. When we finally left the hospital in the early hours of the morning, I knew that my life had fundamentally changed. Rachel's mask had been ripped away in the most public and dramatic fashion possible, and there was no going back for either of us. The drive back to the lake house was silent except for Mom's occasional sniffles and Dad's heavy sighs. When we arrived, the deck where we'd shared our family dinner looked like a crime scene, with wine glasses and evidence markers scattered across the tables. But for me, it looked like liberation. For the first time in my life, I was free from Rachel's shadow, free from her manipulations, free from the constant feeling that I was somehow less worthy of love and respect than my perfect sister. As I finally went to bed as the sun was rising, over Lake Michigan, I felt a sense of peace that I'd never experienced before. Justice had been served, truth had been revealed, and the balance of power in my family had shifted permanently. Rachel had tried to drug me, but instead she'd freed me from a lifetime of her psychological abuse, and tomorrow I would begin building the life I'd always deserved, the life where I was finally seen and valued for who I really was. The weeks following Rachel's hospitalization transformed my family in ways I never could have imagined. What had started as a shocking revelation about attempted poisoning slowly unraveled into a comprehensive examination of decades of manipulation and deceit. Every family member began questioning their memories, re-examining incidents they'd previously attributed to coincidence or bad luck. Mom spent hours on the phone with relatives, piecing together a timeline of suspicious events that stretched back to our childhood. The pattern became undeniable once people started paying attention. Every time I'd achieved something significant, or been on the verge of a breakthrough, some mysterious illness or accident had derailed my progress while Rachel swooped in to claim the spotlight. Dad hired a private investigator to look into Rachel's recent activities, and what they uncovered was both shocking and validating. Bank records showed that she'd been purchasing various medications and chemical compounds online, always in small quantities and always using different vendors to avoid detection. Her browser history revealed extensive research into sedatives, their effects, and how to mask their taste in food and beverages. The investigator also discovered that Rachel had been systematically undermining my professional reputation for years. She'd created fake social media accounts to leave negative reviews for my accounting firm, had contacted potential clients with warnings about my reliability, and had even posed as a former colleague to sabotage job interviews when I'd been considering career changes. Most damning of all, they found evidence that Rachel had been embezzling from Mom and Dad's personal accounts, using their financial information to make unauthorized purchases and transfers. She'd been funding her lifestyle through theft, while positioning herself as the responsible daughter who deserved the family's financial legacy. When Dad called me to share these discoveries, his voice was heavy with guilt and regret. "Venus, I owe you an apology that I'll never be able to fully express," he said, the pain evident in every word. "We failed you as parents. We let Rachel manipulate us into treating you like you were somehow less deserving of our love and support." The conversation was both healing and heartbreaking. Hearing my father acknowledge the injustice I'd endured for so many years was validating in ways I hadn't expected, but it also highlighted just how much of my life had been stolen by Rachel's schemes. "I keep thinking about all the opportunities you missed," Dad continued. "All the times you got sick before important events. All the ways we dismissed your achievements while celebrating hers. She was systematically destroying your life, and we were too blind to see it." The family's awakening to Rachel's true nature had immediate practical consequences as well. Dad and Mom met with their attorney to revise their will and estate planning documents, removing Rachel entirely from any inheritance considerations, the lake house, the family business assets, and all other financial legacies would now come to me exclusively. "We can't undo the past," Mom explained when she called to tell me about the changes. "But we can make sure that your future isn't compromised by someone who has already taken so much from you." The legal proceedings against Rachel moved forward with surprising speed. The evidence of attempted poisoning was overwhelming, and her own confessions at the hospital had been recorded and could be used against her in court. Her lawyer advised her to accept a plea bargain rather than risk a trial that she almost certainly couldn't win. But Rachel wasn't going quietly. From her jail cell, she began reaching out to extended family members, spinning elaborate stories about how I'd manipulated the entire situation. She claimed that I'd somehow orchestrated her downfall out of jealousy and greed, that I'd planted evidence and convinced everyone to turn against her. Most family members saw through her desperate lies, but a few distant relatives who hadn't witnessed the events firsthand began to question the official narrative. Rachel had always been skilled at manipulation, and even facing criminal charges, she was trying to rehabilitate her image by painting herself as the victim of an elaborate conspiracy. The situation came to a head during a family meeting that Uncle Robert organized to address the growing divisions within our extended family. Several aunts and uncles gathered at the lake house to discuss how to move forward, and the tension was palpable from the moment everyone arrived. Aunt Patricia, who had always been one of Rachel's biggest supporters, wasted no time in voicing her concerns. "I just think we're all moving too fast to judgment," she said, settling into one of the deck chairs with obvious discomfort. "Rachel made a mistake, yes, But this idea that she's been systematically sabotaging Venus for years seems far-fetched. Is it really far-fetched? Aunt Margaret countered, her voice sharp with indignation. When you look at the evidence objectively, the pattern is clear. Venus has been the victim of a sustained campaign of psychological and physical abuse. But Rachel was always such a sweet girl, Uncle Frank added, clearly struggling to reconcile his memories with the new reality. She helped with every family event, always remembered birthdays, always seemed so caring and thoughtful. I listened to the debate with a mixture of frustration and fascination. Even with overwhelming evidence of Rachel's crimes, some family members were still struggling to accept that their golden girl could be capable of such systematic cruelty. That's exactly the point, I finally said, standing up to address the group directly. Rachel's greatest skill was making everyone believe she was sweet and caring while she was actually destroying my life piece by piece. The fact that you're having trouble believing it just shows how good she was at her performance. I spent the next hour walking them through the timeline of incidents, showing them the investigators' findings, and explaining how each seemingly isolated event fit into a larger pattern of abuse. By the time I finished, even the most skeptical family members were forced to confront the truth about Rachel's nature. Uncle Frank was the first to break the uncomfortable silence that followed my presentation. "My God, Venus," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We let this happen. We all saw the signs, but we explained them away because Rachel seemed so perfect." "She was counting on that," I replied. "She knew that if she maintained her image as the ideal daughter, nobody would question the string of bad luck that seemed to follow me around." The family meeting marked a turning point in how I was perceived and treated by my relatives. For the first time in my life, I was seen as the victim rather than the problem, the one who deserved sympathy and support rather than judgment and criticism. But perhaps more importantly, it marked the beginning of my own psychological healing. For years, I'd internalized the family's treatment of me, wondering if maybe I really was somehow less deserving of love and respect than Rachel. Learning that her perfection had been a carefully constructed lie, while my struggles had been the result of deliberate sabotage, was both liberating and devastating. I started seeing a therapist to help process the trauma of growing up in such a toxic dynamic. Dr. Sarah Williams specialized in family abuse cases, and she helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just sibling rivalry or parental favoritism. It was a form of psychological warfare that had lasting effects on my sense of self-worth and my ability to trust others. "What Rachel did to you was a form of gaslighting," Dr. Williams explained during one of our sessions. "She made you question your own perceptions and abilities by systematically undermining your successes while presenting herself as the perfect alternative." The therapy sessions were painful but necessary. I had to confront years of suppressed anger, grief for the childhood I'd never had, and fear about my ability to form healthy relationships after growing up in such a dysfunctional environment. But they also helped me recognize my own strength and resilience. Despite everything Rachel had done to sabotage me, I'd still managed to build a successful career, maintain my integrity, and ultimately expose her crimes. I wasn't the weak, unlucky daughter that my family had believed me to be. I was a survivor who had overcome extraordinary challenges. The legal resolution of Rachel's case provided another form of closure. She ultimately pled guilty to attempted poisoning and was sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. The judge was particularly harsh in her sentencing remarks, noting that Rachel had violated the most fundamental bonds of family trust. "The defendant's actions represent a particularly heinous form of domestic abuse," Judge Henderson said during the sentencing hearing. "She systematically destroyed her sister's opportunities and well-being while positioning herself as a loving family member. This court finds her behavior to be especially manipulative and dangerous." I attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the front row where Rachel could see me clearly. When the judge announced her sentence, Rachel turned to look at me with a mixture of hatred and defeat that I'll never forget. For once in our lives, I was the one with power while she was the one facing consequences for her actions. After the hearing, Rachel's lawyer approached me in the courthouse hallway. "My client wanted me to pass along a message," he said awkwardly. "She wants you to know that she's sorry for what happened." I looked at him with genuine confusion. Sorry for what happened? Or sorry that she got caught? He shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that he'd walked into a rhetorical trap. She just wanted me to express her regrets about the situation. "Tell Rachel that her regrets are noted but not accepted," I replied calmly. "And tell her that if she ever tries to contact me or any member of my family again, I'll make sure the authorities know about it immediately." The weeks following Rachel's sentencing were some of the most peaceful I'd ever experienced. For the first time in my life, I could pursue opportunities and make plans without worrying about mysterious illnesses or accidents derailing my progress. The constant low-level anxiety that had been my companion for years gradually began to fade. My relationship with my parents improved dramatically as they worked to make amends for the years of preferential treatment they'd given Rachel. They started including me in family decisions, asking for my professional advice on financial matters, and generally treating me like the competent adult I'd always been. "We're so proud of how you handled everything," Mom said during one of our weekly phone calls. "You could have been bitter and vindictive, but you maintained your dignity throughout this whole ordeal." The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd literally poisoned my sister with her own weapon, but my family saw my behavior as dignified and mature. Rachel's own actions had been so outrageous that my retaliation seemed reasonable by comparison. I also began reconnecting with friends and colleagues who had been puzzled by my pattern of missed opportunities and sudden illnesses over the years. When word spread about Rachel's conviction, many people reached out to express their support and share their own suspicions about her behavior. "I always thought it was weird how you'd get sick right before big presentations or important meetings," my former colleague Jennifer told me over lunch. "But Rachel seemed so concerned about you that I never questioned it." These conversations helped me understand just how extensive Rachel's manipulation had been. She hadn't just fooled my family. She'd convinced my entire social and professional network that I was somehow unreliable or unlucky, undermining my reputation in subtle ways that I'd never fully recognized. The most unexpected benefit of Rachel's exposure was the way it enhanced my professional reputation. Once people understood that my past difficulties had been the result of deliberate sabotage rather than personal failings, they began to see me as someone who had overcome extraordinary challenges to achieve success. I started getting speaking invitations from professional organizations and women's groups who wanted to hear about resilience and overcoming family abuse. My story resonated with audiences who recognized similar patterns in their own lives or the lives of people they cared about. The lake house, which had always felt like a stage for performing family harmony, began to feel like an actual home for the first time. I started spending weekends there alone, enjoying the peace and quiet while planning renovations that would make the space truly mine. I also began the process of legally changing my name, dropping the family surname that had been associated with so much pain and manipulation. Venus Parker would become Venus Sterling, a name I'd chosen to represent the precious metal that emerges stronger and more valuable after being tested by fire. But perhaps the most significant change was in how I viewed myself and my place in the world. For years, I'd defined myself in relation to Rachel, always measuring my worth against her perceived perfection. Now I was free to discover who I really was when I wasn't constantly defending myself against her attacks. I enrolled in art classes, something I'd always wanted to do but had never felt deserving of. I started traveling to places I'd only dreamed of visiting. I began dating again, this time with the confidence that came from knowing my own worth, rather than accepting whatever scraps of affection others might throw my way. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. Decades of psychological conditioning don't disappear overnight, and I often found myself slipping back into old patterns of self-doubt and defensive behavior. But with each passing week, the voice in my head that sounded like Rachel's criticism grew quieter while my own authentic voice grew stronger. 6 months after Rachel's sentencing, I received a letter from her in prison. The return address made my stomach clench with familiar anxiety, but I decided to read it rather than throwing it away unopened. The letter was exactly what I'd expected. 3 pages of manipulation disguised as remorse, with Rachel positioning herself as someone who had made mistakes due to mental health issues rather than acknowledging the deliberate cruelty of her actions. "I know you probably hate me," she wrote, "but I hope someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me. I was struggling with depression and anxiety that made me act in ways that weren't really me. I never meant to hurt you the way I did." The letter was a masterpiece of manipulation, carefully crafted to minimize her responsibility while attempting to evoke sympathy. She painted herself as someone who deserved forgiveness rather than someone who needed to earn it through genuine accountability and change. I read the letter twice, then placed it in a file with all the other evidence of Rachel's crimes. It would serve as a reminder of her true nature if I ever found myself questioning whether she might actually have changed. Then I sat down at my computer and began writing my own letter, though this one wasn't intended for Rachel. It was a letter to my younger self, the girl who had spent so many years wondering why she wasn't good enough, why she couldn't seem to succeed despite her best efforts, why her own family seemed to love her sister more. "Dear Venus," I wrote, "you are not the problem. You are not unlucky or incompetent or undeserving of love. You are under attack by someone who sees your potential and is threatened by it. The strength you're building by surviving this will serve you well when you finally break free." Writing that letter was more therapeutic than months of counseling sessions. It allowed me to speak directly to the wounded child who still lived inside me, offering the comfort and validation that no one else had been able to provide during those difficult years. As I sealed the letter and placed it in my personal safe, I realized that Rachel's attempt to destroy me had ultimately freed me. By pushing me to the breaking point, she'd forced me to fight back and expose her true nature. In trying to eliminate me as competition, she'd actually eliminated herself. The girl who had once felt invisible and unworthy was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own value and refused to accept anything less than the respect she deserved. Rachel had intended to drug me into submission, but instead she'd awakened, a strength I'd never known I possessed. And for that, in a twisted way, I was almost grateful. 2 years after Rachel's sentencing, I stood in the renovated kitchen of the lake house, preparing dinner for a very different kind of family gathering. The space looked nothing like the formal, sterile environment where my parents had once hosted their carefully orchestrated reunions. Gone were the pristine white cabinets and cold marble countertops, replaced with warm wood surfaces and copper accents that actually felt like home. The guest list for tonight's dinner was small but meaningful. Aunt Margaret would be arriving soon with her new partner, a retired professor who shared her love of mystery novels and sharp wit. Dr. Williams, my therapist, was bringing her teenage daughter who was interested in learning about forensic accounting, and Marcus, the man I'd been dating for 8 months, would be meeting my family for the first time. Marcus Rodriguez was everything Rachel would have hated. He was a high school teacher who coached debate team and volunteered at a literacy center on weekends. He drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic and shopped at thrift stores not because he had to, but because he believed in sustainable living. He was the kind of man who valued substance over appearance, authenticity over performance. I'd met him at a coffee shop where I'd been working on a particularly complex fraud case, surrounded by spreadsheets and financial documents that painted a picture of corporate embezzlement spanning 3 years. He'd approached my table not to flirt, but to return a pen I'd dropped, and somehow we'd ended up discussing the ethics of whistleblowing for 2 hours. "You have this way of seeing patterns that other people miss," he'd said during one of our early conversations. "It's like you can read between the lines of numbers and find the stories they're trying to hide." What he didn't know then was that I'd learned to read between the lines out of necessity, developed that skill through years of trying to understand why my own life kept falling apart in ways that didn't make logical sense. Rachel had taught me to look for hidden motives and concealed manipulations, even though she'd never intended for me to turn those skills against her. The irony wasn't lost on me that my ability to excel at forensic accounting, the career that had ultimately given me independence and self-worth, had been honed by surviving my sister's psychological warfare. Every embezzlement scheme I uncovered, every financial fraud I exposed, was made possible by the pattern recognition skills I'd developed while living under Rachel's systematic attacks. As I chopped vegetables for the salad, I found myself thinking about the letter I'd received from Rachel just last week. She was being released from prison early for good behavior, and her probation officer had contacted me to discuss safety protocols and restraining order options. The letter itself was different from her previous attempts at manipulation. Gone were the elaborate justifications and appeals for sympathy. Instead, it was a single paragraph that felt more honest than anything she'd ever written to me. Venus, I know you'll never forgive me, and you shouldn't. What I did to you was unforgivable. I spent our entire childhood destroying your confidence because I was terrified that everyone would realize you were the better daughter. I was right to be afraid. You always were better than me, and now everyone knows it. I won't contact you again. I'd read that letter a dozen times, looking for hidden meanings or subtle manipulations, but it seemed to be exactly what it appeared to be: an admission of guilt without any expectation of redemption. Perhaps prison had actually changed her, or perhaps this was just a more sophisticated form of psychological manipulation. Either way, it didn't matter. Rachel no longer had the power to hurt me. The restraining order was already in place, not because I was afraid of her, but because I refused to give her any opportunity to re-enter my life. I'd learned that the best way to deal with toxic people wasn't to try to fix them or understand them, but simply to remove them from your environment entirely. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway interrupted my thoughts. Marcus was arriving early, just as he'd promised, to help with the final dinner preparations. Through the kitchen window, I watched him climb out of his Honda and stretch, taking a moment to appreciate the view of the lake before grabbing a bottle of wine from his passenger seat. "Smells incredible in here," he said, wrapping his arms around me from behind as I continued working at the counter. "How are you feeling about tonight?" "Nervous," I admitted, leaning back into his embrace. "This is the first time I've hosted anything here since everything happened with Rachel. It feels like I'm reclaiming the space." "You are reclaiming it," he said, pressing a kiss to my temple. "And you're filling it with people who actually care about you. That's what home should be." Source Marcus had a gift for saying exactly what I needed to hear without making it sound rehearsed or therapeutic. He'd grown up in a large, chaotic family where love was expressed through actions rather than words, and he'd taught me that healthy relationships didn't require constant performance or vigilance. "Tell me about Dr. Williams's daughter again," he said, moving to the refrigerator to chill the wine. "Emma, right?" 17, interested in criminal justice, recently finished. "A project on white-collar crime for her AP government class," I recited. "She specifically asked to meet me after her mom mentioned what I do for work." "Smart kid. She'll probably have better questions than most adults." That was another thing I loved about Marcus. He never talked down to young people or dismissed their interests as phases. He treated his students like fully formed humans whose opinions mattered, and it showed in how they responded to him. Aunt Margaret arrived next, her silver hair styled in an elegant bob that made her look 10 years younger than her actual age. Behind her was Eleanor, the retired literature professor who'd become a fixture in Margaret's life over the past year. "Venus, this place looks absolutely stunning," Margaret said, pulling me into one of her signature hugs that lasted exactly the right amount of time. "I love what you've done with the kitchen. It feels so much more welcoming." "Thank you." I wanted it to feel like a place where people actually lived rather than a museum. Eleanor wandered over to the large windows that overlooked the lake, where the setting sun was painting the water in shades of gold and pink. No wonder this house has been in your family for generations. The view alone is worth whatever trauma might be associated with the place. I appreciated Eleanor's directness. She was one of the few people who acknowledged the complicated history of the house without tiptoeing around it, or pretending that a change of decor could erase decades of dysfunction. Dr. Williams and Emma arrived together, and I was immediately struck by how much the teenager resembled her mother. They shared the same thoughtful eyes and careful way of observing their surroundings before speaking. "Ms. Sterling, thank you so much for inviting me," Emma said, offering a firm handshake that suggested she'd been practicing adult social interactions. "I've read about some of your cases in the business journals. The Patterson Industries fraud was brilliant detective work. Please call me Venus, and thank you. That case took 8 months to unravel, but it was worth it to see justice served. Is it true that you identified the embezzlement pattern by noticing discrepancies in employee parking fees?" Emma asked, her eyes lighting up with genuine curiosity. For the next hour, we talked about forensic accounting techniques while Marcus and Eleanor discussed sustainable agriculture and Margaret updated Dr. Williams on the latest family developments. The conversation flowed naturally, without the undercurrent of tension and competition that had characterized every family gathering during Rachel's reign. When we finally sat down to dinner, I found myself looking around the table at these people, who had chosen to be part of my life rather than being forced into it by blood relations. This was what family was supposed to feel like: supportive, genuine, interested in each other's success rather than threatened by it. "I have an announcement," I said as we finished the main course. "I've decided to start my own consulting firm specializing in family financial fraud. There are more cases like mine than people realize, and most victims don't have the resources or knowledge to prove what's being done to them." The table erupted in congratulations and questions about my business plan. Margaret wanted to know about startup costs, Eleanor was curious about marketing strategies, and Emma asked whether I'd be willing to hire high school interns. "What made you decide to focus on family fraud specifically?" Dr. Williams asked. "Because it's the most devastating kind of financial crime," I replied. "When a stranger steals from you, it's a violation of trust. When a family member steals from you, it's a violation of your entire sense of reality." The victims often blame themselves or make excuses for the perpetrator, because they can't accept that someone they love could be so calculating. Marcus reached over to squeeze my hand under the table, a gesture of support that went unnoticed by everyone else, but meant everything to me. He understood that this career pivot wasn't just about helping other people. It was about transforming my trauma into purpose, using my experience to prevent other families from going through what mine had endured. "Have you given any thought to writing about your experience?" Eleanor asked. "I know several publishers who specialize in true crime and family memoirs. Your story could help a lot of people recognize similar patterns in their own lives." The suggestion surprised me. I'd never considered myself a writer, but the idea of documenting Rachel's systematic abuse and my eventual triumph over it was appealing. It would serve as both therapy and warning, a way to process my own experience while potentially helping others escape similar situations. "I actually think that's a brilliant idea," Emma chimed in. "There aren't enough resources for people dealing with financial abuse from family members. Most of the information out there focuses on domestic violence or elder abuse, but what you went through was different." As the evening progressed, I realized that this dinner represented everything Rachel had tried to prevent me from having. I was surrounded by people who valued my intelligence and expertise, who were excited about my successes rather than threatened by them, who saw me as someone worth celebrating rather than someone who needed to be diminished. The contrast with my old family dynamics was striking. Instead of competing for attention or approval, We were genuinely interested in each other's lives and accomplishments. Instead of subtle put-downs disguised as concern, we offered authentic support and encouragement. After dessert, Marcus and I walked down to the dock while our guests enjoyed coffee on the renovated deck. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Thank you for tonight," I said, settling onto the wooden bench that overlooked the water. I know meeting my chosen family isn't exactly a typical relationship milestone. "Nothing about our relationship has been typical," Marcus replied, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "But that's what I love about it. You don't do anything because it's expected or socially required. You do things because they're authentic to who you are." Rachel used to say I was too serious, too intense, too focused on things that didn't matter, I mused. She made me feel like there was something fundamentally wrong with my personality. Rachel was projecting her own insecurities. "Onto you. You're not too serious. You're thoughtful. You're not too intense. You're passionate. And the things you focus on absolutely matter." It still amazed me how easily Marcus could reframe the qualities that Rachel had taught me to see as flaws. Through his eyes, my analytical nature was an asset rather than a social liability. My tendency to dig deeper into problems was valuable rather than obsessive. "I got another letter from her this week," I said, deciding to share the information I'd been processing all evening. Marcus didn't tense up or immediately launch into protective mode the way some men might have. Instead, he simply asked, "How do you feel about that?" Strangely, I felt nothing. No anger, no fear, no curiosity about what she might want. She's just become irrelevant to my life. That's probably the healthiest response possible. Dr. Williams says it means I've successfully processed the trauma and moved beyond defining myself in relation to Rachel's actions. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the gentle lapping of waves against the dock and the distant sound of laughter from the deck. This lake, which had once been the backdrop for so much family dysfunction, was becoming a place of peace and renewal. "I've been thinking about Emma's suggestion," I said eventually, "about writing a book. What would you want to say?" "That sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who know us the best." Rachel was able to sabotage me so effectively because she understood my weaknesses and insecurities. But once I recognized what she was doing, those same insights became weapons I could use to defend myself. The student became the master. Something like that. I also want people to understand that justice doesn't always look like what you expect. I never pressed charges for all the times Rachel poisoned me over the years. I never sued her for the financial damage she caused to my career. But I got something more valuable than legal victories, which was freedom. Freedom from her manipulation, freedom from my family's dysfunction, freedom to build the life I actually wanted rather than the life I thought I deserved. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. That's a powerful message. And coming from someone who actually lived it rather than just theorizing about it, it would have real impact. As we walked back toward the house, I found myself thinking about the girl I'd been 2 years ago, sitting at this same lake house and drinking poisoned wine while her family discussed her future without including her. That girl had felt powerless and invisible, grateful for any scrap of attention or affection her family might throw her way. The woman I'd become was unrecognizable from that earlier version of myself. I owned my own home, ran my own business, chose my own relationships, and defined my own worth. I'd transformed from victim to survivor to advocate, using my experience to help others while building a life filled with genuine love and respect. Our guests were preparing to leave when we returned to the deck, gathering their coats and thanking me for the evening. Emma hugged me goodbye and slipped me a business card for a youth mentorship program she was starting. "If you ever want to talk to teenagers about recognizing manipulation and building self-confidence, we'd love to have you as a speaker," she said. "I'd be honored to participate." Aunt Margaret was the last to leave, lingering on the front porch while Eleanor waited. In the car. "I'm proud of you, Venus," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years of shared family history. "You've taken something toxic and transformed it into something beautiful. Not everyone could have done that." "I had good role models," I replied, thinking of her quiet strength and wisdom over the years. "People who showed me that family isn't just about blood relations. No, it's not. It's about the people who choose to love and support you consistently, especially when it's difficult." After everyone left, Marcus and I cleaned up the kitchen together, working in the kind of easy partnership that develops between people who truly care about each other's well-being. There was something deeply satisfying about washing dishes and putting away leftovers in a space that finally felt like mine. "So what's next?" Marcus asked as we finished drying the last of the wine. "Glasses. Next, I write the book. I formalize the consulting business. I hire Emma as my first intern. I continue building a life that Rachel could never have imagined for me. And us? What's next for us?" I turned to face him, this man who had somehow seen through all my defensive mechanisms to the person I was becoming underneath. "I was hoping you might want to be part of all of it. The book, the business, the life I'm building." His smile was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the lake outside my window, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Rachel's attempt to destroy me had ultimately freed me from a family system that was never going to value me properly. Her jealousy and manipulation had forced me to develop skills and resilience I never would have needed otherwise. In trying to poison my wine, she'd actually poisoned the toxic dynamics that had defined our family for decades. Her exposure had shattered the illusion of perfection that had protected her while making everyone else feel inadequate. And in the aftermath of that shattering, something healthier and more authentic had been able to grow. I'd learned that the opposite of being loved wasn't being hated. It was being ignored, dismissed, or taken for granted. The people around my dinner table tonight had chosen to see me, to value me, to celebrate my successes rather than minimize them. That was what real love looked like. Rachel was scheduled to be released from prison in 3 months, but she would be entering a world where she no longer had power over me or access to my life. The restraining order would keep her physically away, but more importantly, my own growth had made her emotionally irrelevant. The girl who had once desperately wanted her sister's approval had been replaced by a woman who understood that approval meant nothing when it came from someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted. I no longer needed Rachel to see my worth because I'd learned to see it myself. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the title for the book I was going to write. The Wrong Sister Drank the Wine. How Family Betrayal Became My Liberation. It would tell the story of a woman who discovered that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is actually the best thing, because it forces you to stop accepting less than you deserve. The last thing I remembered before sleep took me was the sound of waves against the shore, steady and rhythmic and eternal. Like the truth, which always finds a way to surface no matter how deeply it's been buried. Like justice, which doesn't always come from courts and legal systems, but sometimes from the simple act of refusing to be a victim anymore. Rachel had tried to poison my wine, but instead, she'd poisoned her own future. And I had drunk deeply from the cup of freedom that her downfall had provided. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.